This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Welcome to a Geek Leader podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda. And if you could, please do me a favor and take a moment and leave a rating and review in whatever podcast player you're listening to this on, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, doesn't matter. I would greatly appreciate it. And that feedback really helps get other listeners to the show. Also, if you're not subscribed, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And if you feel so inclined, you can go to geekleader.com/tip and donate to the show. Thanks so much. All right, Geek Leaders, today I'm honored to have Sean Falconer on the show. And he is trying to make the digital economy a safer place. He also is a podcast host, fellow podcast host, and hosts several shows, including the Software Engineering Daily, Software Huddle, and Partially Redacted. He's also head of marketing and developer relations at Skyflow. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well, because they are focused heavily on privacy, which is one of the things that we talk about quite a bit on the show. But anyway, with all that being said, Sean, welcome back. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, if you don't mind, just tell the audience a little bit about your background and kind of how you got to where you are in your career and why that's important to you.
Sure. I would say kind of like a non-traditional background for someone that ends up as a head of marketing. So I'm a classically trained, computer scientist. I did 3 different degrees in computer science. Spent basically my 20s studying engineering, software engineering, computer science, theory and computation and so forth. So I did a PhD in computer science from the University of Victoria. And then I had planned to be a professor or some sort of professional researcher, went to move to the United States from Canada to do a postdoc in bioinformatics at Stanford University. And then while I was there, I ended up actually starting a company on the side with 2 other students. And then after a year of my postdoc, I left the world of academics and Stanford. We had raised some money to go and do that company full time. And I was the CTO and co-founder of that company, which was called Proven, or eventually it was called Proven. It actually had a different name at the beginning. There's a bit of a story to that, but we probably don't have time to go into details. But, and I ran that company for 7 years. And along that path, that was kind of where I got really exposed to the business side of like actually building a business, because that's what you have to do when you found a company. Is sometimes there's just nobody available to do certain things. So I built out our, marketing team, marketing function, SDR organization, learned how to build actual like financial models and pitch investors and all this sort of stuff that wasn't really part of sort of the core competency. I was comfortable building software, but not necessarily doing all these other things. And that's kind of where I got exposure to the marketing side of building a company and business. And then I went on to Google after we sold Proven, and I was there for 4 years as a developer relations leader there, sort of overseeing 4 different API products, developer go-to-market. And then I left Google to join Skyflow 2 years ago as originally their head of developer relations, and now I'm sort of serving a dual role across developer relations as well as all of the functional areas of marketing at Skyflow.
Awesome. Before we get into Skyflow, I do want to ask you, do you have any interest in going back and, living that dream of being a professor, or is that just kind of water under the bridge now?
I mean, I think there's maybe times when the like sheer craziness of startup world gets a little intense, where I'm like, maybe my life would be a little bit easier if I just went back to, teaching and stuff. I do enjoy like teaching and education part, but there's things about the world of academics I don't think that I'm personally a great fit for. It moves a little bit slower than I think I would be happy with ultimately. Same with like big companies, and one of the motivations for leaving Google to go back to the world of startups was because I just love the sort of the chaos and and also the pace of a startup and being able to build something. You're kind of like flying the plane and building it at the same time. And I really enjoy wearing lots of different hats. And I think the world of startups is a place where I really get a chance to do that kind of stuff. Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right. Full-time teaching is my retirement plan. That's what I plan on whenever I'm done with the tech sector. I teach part-time at Winthrop, and I love that. It's it's great, but I'm not gonna go to full-time yet. I gotta experience a little bit more, and when I'm ready to settle down and slow down my pace a little bit, that's when I'll go teach. I think that's my retirement plan. So
yeah, I really I miss working with students. I really enjoyed that part of it. I don't miss like grading papers and the homework assignments and stuff like that. or dealing with, the grant process and all the types of things that come along with being a professor. But there's certainly aspects of it that I miss and would love to be able to, dip my toe in those waters again at some point.
Yeah. And there are certain areas or certain schools you can go to where you don't have to do the grant part as well if you're non-tenure track,
Yeah.
and things like that. But anyway, that's a whole nother topic for discussion. So what you mentioned, that you kind of got into developer relations. Why is that a interesting area for you?
Yeah. So the story behind that was when I left my company and I was kind of trying to figure out what I was going to do next. Even though I worked as a software engineer in the past, I've done a lot of technical training. I also, as a founder, I was doing all these different things. So I kind of was like, where do I fit in the world at this point? Do I go back to pure engineering? Do I go into product or some other lean into marketing and some of the skills that I had there? And I was trying to figure that out. And then I took some product management interviews and explored that path. And then I decided, well, maybe I'll focus on engineering because that's kind of like what my roots were. I know how to prepare for that interview process. Let's go and do that, and deep dive into just being an IC at a company that I am excited to work for. And I was referred to Google from a friend of mine, and he referred me as a software engineer. And then they called me and they're like, "Hey, we saw we got your application. We're happy to interview you for a software engineering role, but looking at your background, seeing that you taught at university and presented at conferences and, blogged online for a long time, we think you would be a really good fit for developer relations. Is that something you would be interested in?" And I was like, awesome. What is developer relations? Like, I had as it sounded good, I was like, oh, I'm glad they're excited about me, but I had no idea what that actually was. And then they explained to me, that there's a variety of different roles within developer relations at Google. They explained a couple different ones. And the one that I was attracted to at the time was developer advocate, which has since been rebranded as developer relations engineer within Google. But I like that it was a little bit more cross-functional than being purely a software engineer. It was still engineering, but there also was this educational component to it. Also being sort of the face of Google externally or the face of Google engineering externally, representative of the product. Those things were really appealing to me as someone who was coming off a journey as a founder, because it allowed me to sort of continue to flex the muscles that are a little bit more cross-functional than purely engineering. So I was excited about that. And I had a unique opportunity there as well to join a new product. So even though I was in this massive company of like 100,000 people, I got to be kind of a founder experience within that company where I was founding the developer relations function for a new product area. And by the time I left, I was overseeing 4 different API products there and had started as a single IC and then actually, grew that into building my own team and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that a lot of engineers may not realize how in-depth developer advocate and developer relations role really is, and I've got several friends that work in that role at different companies. And, when you not only have to be able to present at conferences and give nice speeches, but you have to actually know, what you're doing. You have to know the code behind it. You have to actually be able to develop. And, it's one of those things where you have to learn, all the ins and outs of the API or the tool, whatever it is that you're working with, and how to build on that so that when you present at conferences, when questions come up, whenever you're doing a workshop, you can actually answer those questions properly and help the engineers learn, whatever it is that you're advocating for.
Yeah, and ideally, there's also a feedback cycle to the actual company where you're taking in that feedback and
Right.
helping the product and engineering team build a better product for the people who are ultimately going to be using it. So that's also really important. So you need to be able to understand not only what people are asking, be able to answer those questions, but how do I essentially relay those as requirements or potential, product enhancements. So it really is very cross-functional where you're sort of in the intersection between engineering, product, and marketing, which I think is a really fun, exciting place to be. And depending, to your point, depending on who your audience is, I feel like developer relations is so much about, especially advocacy, authenticity. And if you can't connect with the people who are the users of the product because you don't reach, you're not able to talk at the same technical depth or something like that, then it's not going to come across very authentic or engaging. Right. And people are going to want to take your thoughts and opinions or your talk or whatever it is that you're presenting very seriously. So you need to be able to match them at that level. Like if you're selling to CTOs and that's your audience, then you need to be able to talk to CTOs the way that they want to be able to, be addressed and how they would talk to their peers and so forth.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And, that's when I look back at, before I got into management and kind of, I still do some development on the side, but not really like my full-time daily, activities. When I was at conferences, I'd hear someone, giving a talk about their product, and, when they started doing coding in public, and doing the live coding, that's where I really engaged, and I was really able to be drawn into it, and I could see, things that I would use on a daily basis and things that would, connect with me, and that was really helpful. So I'm guessing you see the same thing.
Yeah, I think it's all about trying to get people to that like aha moment where they are like generally excited about it. One of the things that I really enjoyed during my time at Google was I ran a lot of hands-on workshops, and we had this product that we were rolling out sort of country by country. And I remember we had, partners. It was mostly a partner-led sort of go-to-market. And we had these partners that was one of the largest sort of messaging providers in South America based out of Mexico City. And they'd been a partner for years, but had never actually sent a single API call. They were just kind of like, engaged, but not really that engaged. And then I went and ran a hands-on workshop in Mexico City. They sent 3 engineers to that workshop. They never ever sent an API call. And then within 3 hours of the workshop, they had built a full conversational experience on this platform using Dialogflow and the APIs that we provided. And then the next week, they were pitching 3 of the largest banks in South America this experience. And that never would have happened without sort of just getting them in a room, connecting with them as a, engineer to engineer, and also getting them to that aha moment where they're like, oh, wow, this is really powerful. This is really exciting. Because a lot of times when it comes to technology, people are busy, like they're busy doing their job. So they're not necessarily going to go out and seek like, on their own time, some new experience. You kind of have to bring it to them sometimes, especially when it's like new technology, and, get them in a room and like lock down their phones and stuff so you can actually get their attention for a few hours and then get them to that aha moment.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And, that's the beauty of conferences and, events like that you can go and you can kind of shut off work for a little bit and learn and figure out what's new. What can you bring back? And, I think sessions are really great, but the most important thing for me is that track in between the sessions where you're meeting with people and you're learning about, common struggles that you both have and talking about solutions that they are trying and what you're trying and what's working and what's not working and sharing that. And I think that's really important.
Absolutely.
So tell me a little bit about, why privacy and what interests you in, that right now?
Yeah. So it's maybe I can give a little bit of background on like why I joined, and then we can get to, what Skyflow is. But so originally the CEO co-founder of Skyflow is Anshu Sharma. And, I was still at Google, and he actually reached out to me on LinkedIn and sent me a message, and he was an investor in the company I started. So that's how we originally got to know each other. And he's like, I don't know if you've heard, but I, started a company, might be interested in having a conversation. And I originally looked at it, I was like, privacy, I don't know. Like that doesn't sound that, I don't know that much about the space. Like, is that interesting? And they had this tagline, what if privacy had an API? And then I took some time away from it and I kept thinking about it. And I was like, actually, that's like a really interesting idea, because I remembered my experience of dealing with things like PCI compliance at my own company, or HIPAA compliance, some of the things the challenges I faced when I was at Google. And I was like, if I could abstract that away into an API, the way that I can make, programmatically send a text message or make a phone call or do a payment through platforms like Twilio and Stripe, that's amazing. Like if I can essentially just offload that to an API through an abstraction layer and not have to deal with that as an engineer, that's incredible. So that's like was the hook for me. I was really sold on this idea of just privacy as an abstraction. And really the fundamental problem that we're trying to address is that if you look at our industry, or really any industry, over the last 20 to 30 years, there's like barely an interaction that you have with a business where they're not collecting some information about you.
Oh, yeah.
We're giving up our social security number, our home address, even when we're online, our IP addresses and so forth. And all this stuff says something about who we are. And despite, people's best efforts and billions of dollars being spent on this, there's ever increasing like epidemic of data breaches. Like there's 20% more data breaches in 2023 than the year before. So it's not like it's going away. And that's really the problem that we're trying to solve. Like, why is it that businesses essentially can't collect this information about their customers and keep it actually private and safe So how can we essentially create technology that allows them to keep it secure, but still usable? And essentially what Skyflow does is we're able to take customer information, PII, personally identifiable information, your name, your email address, whatever it is, and essentially transform it into a non-sensitive version of that information that still allows you to perform all the sort of workflows that you would need as an engineer. So that could be, building an LLM, machine learning, analytics, sharing the data with a third party to perform, money movement, payment transactions, whatever it is that you need to do with this kind of information, but essentially keep it private and secure. So that's what we offer to these different customers that we work with.
So I'm going to ask some questions about that in a minute, but before we do, I know that's one of the challenges that I still see, regularly is how to secure data, and especially when you have like your marketing and data group wanting to collect more data and analyze it, and find out who's doing this or that, who's visiting your site, and who's interacting the most, who's not. And then you have like your security folks over here who are saying like, we need to store as least data as possible so we're not liable. We have our risk management group saying, no, we don't want to keep that. We don't want to keep that. Offload that. So how is it that you guys come in there and bridge those two groups together?
Yeah. So, I think companies should be thinking about data minimization, like when we are collecting information. Like the wild west of data, from 15 years ago is kind of over. We still need to be thinking when we're building systems, like it's not just about purely like gobbling up as much data for, a rainy day down the road. We should be thinking about how are we actually, like, why are we collecting this information? And privacy a lot is about like transparency to your users, like explaining to them why you need, this type of information, and giving them sort of the controls over whether it's like deleting it or removing it, or understanding what it is that you're doing with it while you're collecting it. That's a big thing. It's not that businesses shouldn't be able to ask you what your name is, but you should understand as a consumer of that business why they need that information.
Right.
But in terms of sort of bridging the gap there, really what we need to do is empower teams like a marketing team or an analytics team or whoever it is to be able to do the types of jobs that they need to perform without actually risking the exposure of that customer data. So if we think about something like passwords. So there was a time 20 years ago when we used to store passwords in a database in plain text. And, luckily we moved away from that world. But what we realized was that the only kind of operation that we would need to perform with a password is check to see whether it exists or not. So you can actually do that without storing the password. You can essentially destroy the password through salting and hashing and store like a representation of the password. And then essentially you could still provide that functionality of checking to see whether a password exists or not, but you don't need to store the plain text version. And what Skyflow does through something that we pioneered known as polymorphic data encryption was essentially apply kind of similar thinking, but to all forms of customer data. So how can I essentially, for a customer service agent, the only thing that they need to do with maybe someone's phone number is see the last 4 digits. How can I do that essentially in a secure way without essentially decrypting the full phone number and then applying some sort of dynamic mask? How can I allow them to only see the last 4 digits? Or how can I, perform a query operation against fully encrypted data to pull back customers that are within, the state of California or something like that? So what we've done is we've thought through all those different use cases and allowed people to essentially stay in this world of encrypted data and perform these types of operations to get like assertions on the data, same way that we would check to see whether a password exists or not, but for all forms of PII. Because most of the time what we need is not necessarily the actual raw data. We need to perform true false statements or some sort of analytical operation on the data. And now through a lot of modern encryption techniques and other approaches that we're pioneering, we can actually support all those workflows without essentially exposing or risking your internal employees or your customers' data.
Yeah, no, that's really great. And I can think back to, it may have been my second full-time job ever back in the late 1990s. I worked as a database analyst / administrator for a university. And one of the things we had to do was to look up like alumni that had donated X number of dollars or greater in a certain area. And all that data was stored in plain text, and back then. And now I'm thinking about it, what you're saying is I don't need to see that data. I don't need to know what address they live in. I don't need to know how much they've donated. I just needed to be able to ask basically a true false, do they live within 30 miles of Chicago? have they ever donated more than $10,000? And if I get trues on both of those, then give me that list so that we can.
You might not even need the list though. If the
right, I just need an operation to send them.
Yeah. Like if you're sending them an email or even like physical mail, that's all API enabled. So you could essentially just tell tell Skyflow like, hey, here's the criteria for these customers, and then send here's the email or whatever it is that I need to send them. Just take care of that in the sort of world of encrypted data, and it's the functionality of reaching out to those people, but you don't actually need to know who those people are. It's similar to like when you call your Uber driver, you see a phone number pop up on your phone, but it's not the actual Uber driver's phone number.
Right.
It's a proxy, and they don't see your phone number. You don't see their phone number for privacy reasons. And there was a time when Uber didn't do that, and it was a problem, but we could solve that problem through using a proxy number. And essentially, we could solve a lot of these issues around privacy and security by thinking about things as using essentially what we provide a Skyflow data privacy vault as a proxy to the actual sensitive data that's always kind of insulating your systems from exposure of the PII, but still allowing you to perform all these kinds of operations that like we were talking about.
So one of the things that I know has been a struggle for tech leaders over the last several years is, ensuring that they're staying compliant with GDPR and California privacy and even PCI. That's one of the things that, annually you have to go through that whole process, making sure all your stuff is your I's are dotted and T's are crossed. How is it that you guys help with that? And what are some of the challenges that you have keeping up with that?
Yeah. So the Skyflow data privacy vault essentially is, PCI compliant, HIPAA compliant, GDPR attested, as well as essentially across the spectrum of other privacy regulations. There's now over 100 privacy regulations in the world. And also we're able to essentially comply with things like data residency regulations, which is one of the biggest challenges that global businesses now face is, if I want to operate in South Africa, Australia, and Singapore, then I need to, figure out a way to keep my customer data in those different geographies, as well as perform any compute within them and know what the international transfer laws are and so forth. So what you get out of the box by essentially using a Skyflow data privacy vault is you're offloading essentially all the technical hurdles that you would need to jump through in order to be compliant with those different regulations. So usually there's some sort of shared responsibility. So if you look at something like HIPAA, there's technical requirements of HIPAA where you need to be able to de-identify 18 different fields that HIPAA specifies. And you basically get that for free out of the box with Skyflow. But then there's other responsibilities that are more less technology based, like notifications for data breaches and so forth, where there's still a responsibility of the actual business that's operating, but you're offloading all the technical requirements, especially in the PCI compliance state. I mean, there's a reason why a lot of companies choose to do payments through providers like Stripe or Adyen or some other payment service provider, is because you're offloading PCI compliance by using that platform. You can do a similar thing with Skyflow, except the advantage that you get there is rather than your data being locked away in Stripe where you can't really touch it, you essentially still own the data within your Skyflow vault. And it gives you flexibility to use multiple payment providers or, change payment providers depending on, what requirements are. And a lot of times businesses reach a certain scale using one payment service provider like a Stripe, where it gets really expensive or it doesn't work for certain geographies or not as well for certain geographies, and they want to eventually get off those platforms. They outgrow them, and they want to have the flexibility to use multiple payment service providers, so we can essentially enable that workflow for them.
Yeah, and I can speak from personal experience. It's very difficult sometimes when you have outgrown one and your data is locked away, and then you have to go back to your customers and say, hey, we're using this new payment processing. You need to re-enter your saved credit card again.
Yeah, it's incredibly easy to get started with most of those systems, incredibly difficult to actually get your data out of them in a PCI compliant way. But we can actually if you work with Skyflow, if you're using something like Stripe, you can actually migrate directly from Stripe to Skyflow. We have that whole workflow. It's called, it's something we call pipelines, Skyflow pipelines. We've done that for a number of different businesses, like billions and billions of credit card records. And you can essentially do that seamlessly through our platform. But that is like a kind of unnecessary challenge or hoop that a lot of companies have to jump through because they want to lock you into those vendors.
Yeah, absolutely. And why wouldn't they?
Yeah, sure.
What are some of the challenges that you see, especially with international businesses, when it comes to, uh, using something like this? Like you mentioned before, like with South Africa, having to have your data stored there. Do you guys facilitate the storing of that data there? Is it something that the business needs to do, or how does that work?
Yeah, so we can deploy Skyflow vaults pretty much anywhere in the world. So we serve over 100 different countries. So you could have a vault essentially in South Africa, one in India, one in Europe, the US, wherever essentially you need your customer data to live. And then your sort of global data center, whether that's on AWS or whatever it is that, services that you're using, it's essentially de-scoped from the data residency requirements because it's only ever operating against non-sensitive versions of that data. So these are just like references or stand-ins that are going to live in your application database, maybe in your data warehousing system, and so forth. And that not only reduces sort of the risk level of those systems, because if they do get compromised, it's all non-sensitive data that is not going to leak anything, but it also reduces your requirements from a data residency and also other privacy regulations perspective significantly, because they're saving, you have no PI.
No PI system.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then essentially you can still perform all the sort of workflows that you need, like global analytics and so forth at that level.
Yeah, and you mentioned, we talked briefly about emailing or mailing. There's a workflow for that, so I don't have to store their address. I could, call an API that then generates the.
Exactly. So you would call Skyflow with the essentially the reference of their email address, and then Skyflow would automatically, within its secure environment, transform that into the real email address, pass it over to the email relay that you want to use, and essentially you could use the in-country email relay to make sure that you're not doing an international data transfer for that, and everything is going to be, work and be compliant.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. And I guess you could do the same thing for mailing too, if you had to do, like, one of the things I have a Tesla, and they had that recall recently, and the recall is really just a software update, which is ridiculous that they call it a recall. But I got a letter in the mail that had to be mailed because our government requires you, for a vehicle recall, to mail you a piece of mail. And I'm like, this is absolutely ridiculous for something that's a software update. I could have just got a notification on my phone, because I have to have a phone because it's the key to my car. This is absolutely ridiculous. But I guess you could do the same thing. You could have a workflow that then kicks off an actual physical mailing to go off from a third-party mail provider.
Yeah, there's API services that exist now for sending physical mail as well. So if you needed that to be in a specific country, I'm sure you could find a country-specific, API provider that actually just, delivers a physical piece of mail.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So fascinating how many different uses there are for data like that. So what are some of the more fascinating things that you've seen companies using Skyflow for?
Yeah. So there's one that I always reference. I think is really interesting, where it was a customer that needed to know whether their customers, so basically our customer's customer, is over the age of 21. And they have a scan of the person's driver's license, picture, photo ID, and they don't want to see any of the information. This kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. They just need an assertion on that data. So what they do is the binary files are uploaded directly into their Skyflow vault. So it's, they're offloading even their front end system from seeing any of the data directly into their vault, and then they can just ask Skyflow, is this person over 21 or not? And then they run a secure function. So you can run essentially computations within the vault, within the secure environment. And it does OCR, object character recognition, on the image, pulls out the date of birth, and then just checks to see, is this person over 21 based on the current epoch, and then returns true or false. So you're getting essentially all that value. It's like, checking the password again without, taking on the risk of, like, how do I store this data? How long do I hold on to it? Who has access to it? I'm like, no, basically I can do the work that I want to do without actually seeing it. I think we're also seeing a lot of exciting things in the world of LLMs and generative AI right now. And one of the big challenges there is, how do I use employee data or customer data to either train a foundation model or augment a foundation model, perform inference without leaking PII into those models or my core IP or something like that. And that's where, we saw this past year, companies like Samsung and Apple and so forth, shut down access to things like ChatGPT, or even countries like Italy temporarily shut down access to ChatGPT. And realistically, like those shutdowns are kind of band-aids. Like you can always go to another system that's a competitor, or you could run, call API, make API calls directly, or if it's your company's Wi-Fi, connect through the data on your phone to do it. But people are going to circumvent those systems because they find value in it. So how can we essentially enable people to do the things that they want to do with those without risking the exposure of that information? So we have essentially a way to use Skyflow as like a privacy gateway for LLM training and inference. And essentially all you're doing is passing the data that you want to do training for through your Skyflow vault or your privacy gateway. And essentially we're replacing all the sensitive data with non-sensitive versions of that data, because really like the LLM doesn't need to know my name, Sean Falconer. It just needs a representation of that name, right? Because it's just going to become vectorized data in space somewhere anyway. And it needs to know the context that this is actually a name and be able to consistently generate that reference. But that's it. It could be essentially a random string. And we could provide that for training. And then on the same side, when we perform inference, if I essentially need to say like, where was Sean Falconer born or something like that, then we can perform the same transformation where we replace Sean Falconer with that non-sensitive version, pass that over to the LLM. It can perform inference as it normally would, and then re-identify the data on the back end, back to the user. And that re-identification step is really important, because that's where you can actually apply fine-grained access control to make sure that the user that asked for that information actually has the rights to see that information. Because that's where a lot of companies are struggling right now in generative AI, is not just how do I keep this sensitive data out, but how do I make sure that the person who's seeing it is the person that should be able to see it. And, what level of access that do they have? It really comes down to controlling, who sees what, when, where, and for how long that matters.
Yeah. Do you see this as being like almost like you're playing whack-a-mole with all these different things that are out there where privacy, could get leaked out, because when ChatGPT first became like really mainstream, very few people thought about privacy. They didn't think like, oh, I'm putting this in here and asking it to summarize this. I didn't really think about the fact that it was consuming this information and now using that for something later down the road that I wasn't aware of. Do you feel like this is going to just be, happening more and more?
So I guess like I have a couple thoughts on that. One is I do think that if you compare this to like the explosion of like social networks from like 15 years ago, I do think that we move much faster around the concerns of data sharing in the world of generative AI than we did 15 years ago. So I think the world is in a better place, both from like a consumer perspective and a regulatory perspective, than we were, 15 years ago. And already, like if you look at President Biden's executive order last year, a lot of it was about privacy concerns around AI. Europe's already moving forward with an AI Regulation Act. So compare that to GDPR, which didn't come in until 2018, and how long were, platforms like Facebook and X and so forth around before that, like quite a while. It took a long time for the world to catch up. So I do think that we're in a better position and concerns are real. But I think when it comes to our approach that we've taken at Skyflow, like we've taken a very first principles approach to how do you solve this. If you look at the leadership team at the company, none of us are really like have security backgrounds. We're all data people. We came from places like Salesforce and Microsoft and Google and Oracle and so on. And these were problems that we saw at those different companies. And we approached it like, how do you solve this as a data problem? Not as something that you put as like a band-aid to existing, solution. And that's where this concept of a data privacy vault really came in. And we haven't really had to adapt that technology to the new concerns around the world of LLMs and stuff. It just fits naturally because we're solving this as a fundamental data problem. And I think the fundamental problem that we've had historically when it comes to data is essentially treating all information the same, whether that's collecting someone's name and address or, clicks on a web page. It's kind of, those are zeros and ones, we'll stuff them in a database. And essentially the approach that we've taken is like, hey, that is not the same type of data. It's fundamentally different. And it deserves a different type of technology to be able to handle that information the same way that we've offloaded, encryption keys to KMSs or, passwords to identity providers. Over time, we've realized that certain types of data is special. We need special handling for it. And I think PII is a different class of data that requires special handling. And essentially the right approach to that is this concept of a data privacy vault.
Do you see in the future things like this conversation being something that needs to be in a data privacy vault, with deep fakes and things like that going on?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I do think that there is a big challenge. Well, it's not quite there yet, but I think we're starting to kind of get there with the deep fakes. There was even forget the company now, but there was a breach that happened. Retool a few months ago, where they used deepfake audio to sound like one of the employees of the business. So these types of things are happening. I think that there probably is some adaptation that needs to happen, like some new type of technology to be able to determine, is this real or not? And you're actually seeing a lot of this work now, especially in LLM world, is like, how do I know whether the text was generated by an LLM versus a person? So there is a bunch of like, initiatives or like new types of work that is doing that. But I think that's like a brand new frontier that we're still like trying to figure out.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting, especially with like elections and things like that, of how people use this kind of information. I know I was just playing around with it. A friend of mine was trying to record an audio message for something, and he was struggling, kept missaying things. So I was like, hold on, let me just go here. So I went to 11 Labs, uploaded a video that he had from YouTube, took his audio, typed it in there, said, here you go. So one of those things where I could fake it easier than he could actually really record it. So
yeah, I mean, I think with a lot of these technologies, there's really good uses of them. Like, we're talking a lot of the privacy security concerns around generative AI, but I also think like generative AI is very much a net positive for the world. Like, I think some of the stuff that we're starting to see come out of biotech with drug discovery and other applications within the health sector is amazing. It's going to transform biology, and there's a lot of stuff that probably wouldn't be possible without being able to use these technologies that are specially designed for analyzing massive amounts of information that goes beyond like what a human would be possibly able to do. But at the same time, we need to balance this with the negative trade-offs that could exist there as well.
Yeah, especially like in rad tech, just viewing images and detecting, disease or cancer or something like that really quickly is absolutely going to be, a game changer. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Sean, it's been a great conversation. I really appreciate having you on. If you don't mind, tell the audience about how they can connect with you online, learn more about what you're doing, and how to listen to your shows.
Sure. You can find me on LinkedIn or X at Sean Falconer, just my name. Well, I'm sure it's somewhere in the show notes, so you can search for me. And then in terms of podcasts, you can look up in your, whatever your favorite podcast listening device is, Software Huddle, Partially Redacted, or Software Engineering Daily. All those shows will appear there. Software Engineering Daily, I host the Tuesdays episodes. It's a shared workload. We do about 5 episodes a week. So I do every Tuesday.
Awesome. Sounds great. I'll link those in the show notes too at geekleader.com so people can click through there. Again, thanks so much, Sean.
Thanks for having me. It was really fun.
Hope you enjoyed the show. Please go to geekleader.com to learn more about what this guest is up to, click on their links, and connect with them online. I would also greatly appreciate it if you could leave me a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. Make sure you've subscribed if you haven't already. And if you feel so inclined, you can leave me a tip by going to geekleader.com/tip.